All right, here we go. We keep continuing through Unit 3. And today we focus on the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. Of course, these are just brief overviews that will go into more detail later. So here's a quote by Benjamin Franklin. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man as far as by it he does not hurt or control the right of another. You see that how this is going to come up today. And this is the only check it ought to suffer, and the only bounds it ought to know. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freedom of speech, a thing terrible to traitors. And remember, Ben Franklin was many things, but what was his primary job? He was a printer and printed newspapers. So when we think of speech, I want you to think of expression, because often with speech, we just think of words that come out of our mouths. But it can be more than verbal speech. It can be things in the print. It can be symbolic speech, things in the media, ways you spend your money to express things. And it also protects the opposite. You have the right to not express yourself in certain ways. There's reasons why some politicians don't swear an oath when they take their oath of office, right? And it's come to evolve and mean different things over time. In the early 90s, flag burning of the American flag was a big debate, and it came up to the Supreme Court. And they said that protest is a form of speech and is therefore protected. You're allowed to contribute money to certain political campaigns as a form of your speech. And of course, one of our landmark cases that we go over is Tinker v. Des Moines, which said that even though the school did have a dress code, students protesting the war by wearing black armbands was not disruptive to their school day and was a protected form of speech. Now, I want you to keep in mind when we do this amendment, it starts off with Congress shall make no law. So you're like, okay, the federal government protects your speech, but does the state government have to? And the answer to that is yes, because of selective incorporation. Right? Other factors to keep in mind. So there are limitations to your speech as decided by court cases. For example, you can't, well, the armbands were acceptable. You wouldn't be able to do something if it interfered with school operations, right? You can't just get up and talk all through class and say it's your freedom of speech if it's hindering other people's learning process. There's just one random example. So this right has been scaled back in some ways because the Supreme Court has realized that students, right, people like you are impressionable and you are a captive audience. And it's hard to not have some sort of speech like that would not sort of demand your attention. Okay. When is speech unlimited? Well, if it's content neutral, right? It's not disruptive. But even then, the context matters, right? The time, place, whatever. In other words, it's really good to eat your vegetables, right? That's not going to harm anyone to tell people to eat vegetables. But you can't get a bullhorn and go outside people's homes at 3 a.m. and say, eat your vegetables, right? That's disruptive. So things like that do matter. And I'm using ridiculous examples, but when you go through cases, sort of think, well, is this disruptive? Is this harmful? Not just, is it something that people might find offensive or not agree with, right? There's no right to not be offended. Okay. Another case we'll discover on this is Schenck v. U.S., right? You have a right, but is it causing harm? Is it and I'm sorry, I'm just getting annoyed because I got more notifications that now Tom Brady is officially retiring. I don't care about you anymore, Tom Brady. Narcissistic. All right. And then we go into freedom of the press. Like I said, we'll spend more time on Schenck v. U.S., but just keep in mind that that's one of the examples we'll do. All right. So why is the press essential to the survival of democracy? I alluded to that with the Benjamin Franklin quote. And this is a line from Thomas Jefferson to Marquis de Lafayette. All right, hopefully you know who that is. And he said, the only security of all is in a free press. Very similar to Franklin's statement. The force of public opinion cannot be resisted when permitted freely to be expressed. The agitation it produces must be submitted to. It is necessary to keep the waters pure. And interestingly enough, the Washington Post, right? All media has bias, but I want to bring this out to an example. Their tagline is "Democracy dies in darkness," and this came out in 2017. You can think of Trump's coming to the office of the presidency in 2016, the sort of fake news um, era statements, and why do you think they responded with something like that? Um, so a little bit of the freedom of the press. Why is it important? Well, it protects minority groups that has their access to relay information. It also protects the majority against a self-interested Congress, which that in turn helps protect democracy. Right? And therefore, it's one of the foundations of a participatory democracy theory. This is something that many people can have access to, can contribute to. You don't need to be elected to write into a letter to the editor. If you're in an early morning class and you see the viewer callers in C-SPAN, right? From one crazy idea to not crazy ideas, that's participatory democracy. Now, some history here. 1733. The Zenger trial. And Zenger printed articles about a corrupt royal governor, this guy, William Cosby. Bill Cosby? Um, and it was declared libel and seditious. Back then, you couldn't speak bad against the government. So imagine if you were never able to complain. How would Twitter even exist, people? Right? Wouldn't. His defense, though, was that truth, right? You can't, but if what you're writing is true, is it libel and seditious? So his lawyer was this guy, Andrew Hamilton, no relation to Alexander Hamilton. This is years earlier. He was from Virginia, lived most of his life in Philadelphia. There's a term, a Philadelphia lawyer, being a good thing. He's the one who sort of created that term, even though this was a New York case. I believe it was a New York case. I'll double check. But he helped, as a defense lawyer, prove that he was not guilty. This is a line from him, from Andrew Hamilton. Liberty both of exposing and opposing tyrannical power by speaking and writing the truth, right? So even before we were a republic, right, this is 1733, seeing the harm, right, seeing how tyranny can arise when you're not able to speak and writing the truth. So you see the line, the connection to that democracy dies in darkness idea, right? So this was a really important trial because of freedom of the press and a few other things that we can discuss. Now, what is a shield law? That means that reporters can shield confidential sources. They don't need to expose them. There's prior restraint. So a government cannot like pre-censor, like they can't be like, oh, I need to see your articles before you print them. Okay, take this part out here. Nope, take this out. That can't happen. Now, afterwards, they can sort of litigate that something should not have been printed, right? So in other words, if they publish statements, it has to be in good faith that it's right. It may be found afterwards that it was wrong, but there has to be evidence to show that it was in good faith by the time of printing. Right? So what does freedom of the press not include? You can't just incite imminent lawlessness, I should say, right? You can't just, that doesn't mean you can't say people should protest, right? But you can't incite imminent lawlessness. You can't publish false statements if you are aware that they could incite lawlessness and you have malice. You're just trying to do harm. Doesn't mean you can't criticize someone, right? There's a difference. You can't say reporter's privilege and not testify if there's a compelling state interest, okay? If the Russians are going to attack us, unless we get this information from the reporter, they can't say reporter's privilege. Now, I don't think the Russians are going to attack us, but I'm just trying to say, right? If it's a compelling state interest, you can't claim that. Common good, right? You can't publish false statements with awareness and recklessness, so either against officials or just in general. Okay, and also going back to students, you can't print things that disrupt the educational process within your school. How does this relate to social media? There's a Supreme Court case about that recently, and we can discuss that and discuss that to current issues you might be facing. All right. Like I said, we'll go in this more detail and go over how are these being used currently in the news media today. All right. Later, guys.